This is Shelf Life, a place for artists to share the books they love. Joining us is children's book illustrator and university professor Melissa Crowton.
So this one's Berlioz the Bear by Jan Brett. It's one of the Scholastic editions, so I can tell I got this at the book fair. I just loved this book when I was a kid, and I got it from my kindergarten teacher. So she has it written up here for Merry Christmas from my kindergarten teacher. So Jan Brett is a illustrator who often does books based on like folktales around the world. So she's really good at making other countries' like folklore and traditions accessible to like especially a US audience, which is great. And a lot of the time she'll recharacterize the people in the books as animals, which is a theme in my personal work as well. I really love animals that are given like humanistic qualities. And the thing that I loved about her books in general is she does this type of device where she's telling the main story, but she always has this frame that has like an additional story at the same time. So Berlioz is basically trying to get to a place where he can play. He's in a band. So you follow that along the whole time, but then you can see all the villagers in the frame like getting ready for them to come as well. So I love that dual narrative as well. So that was kind of like my first introduction of how books can have multiple narratives for you to follow and like a deeper sense of the story as well. And then the second one that I remember adoring as a kid was from James Marshall and Harry Allard, the Miss Nelson series. So it was 3 books, they were separate. I have this as a collection. So it's Miss Nelson is Missing, Miss Nelson is Back, and Miss Nelson Has a Field Day. And I just love the like quality in his illustrations. They're so unique, and I loved the story. So what happens in these books is Miss Nelson is the teacher, she goes missing, and then you have Viola Swamp who shows up kind of like to get the class back in shape. And then you kind of, as a kid, know that Viola Swamp is Miss Nelson at the same time, but then you kind of don't, which is what I kind of love about it. So this one was like the other book that I just remember like reading these to death. And when I found out more about James Marshall as an adult, I started loving him even more, not only because I love his aesthetic, but he studied French and history, I believe, when he was in school. And when he was a kid, he really liked art, and he would draw a lot in school, but he had a teacher who kind of like laughed at it and kind of discouraged him from following art, so he decided not to do it. And it wasn't until he was in his 30s that he picked up art again and started drawing. And so he talks in interviews about how he was grateful in the sense that he was glad that he found his calling again to make art, but also that he didn't maybe necessarily have some of the burdens that art school comes with. Because his work is a little bit more on the like simplistic expressionistic side. But I find his work so compelling in the way that he does character, and of course the story by Harry Allard is definitely like part of that success as well. I think school can be really great, but unfortunately, I think in any kind of situation where you kind of have to quantify things in a setting, so school has like assignments, it has grades, you're consistently doing the same things that everyone else is, although you have your own style, right? But you kind of have to like fit within a certain mold to some extent. I feel like school was really good for me, especially when I went to grad school. Like that helped me understand a lot more about myself. However, I do feel like I've learned the most when I've been out of school. So I kind of feel like I'm contradicting myself, and I'm like, I feel like our school's great and I think it's really helpful. But I think that what I needed was like learning certain skills in school and the structure, and then when I was by myself, I felt a little bit more free to just do whatever I wanted and listen to myself a little bit more, because I might personally get really caught up in like listening to too many people. And I was like, okay, when I'm by myself, potentially no one's gonna see this. I can make mistakes very quickly. I can throw it away without being like, but this is for a grade. Like I can just chuck it in the garbage can. And I kind of pushed myself a little bit more creatively. And I think it gave myself more confidence too, because I was like, oh, this is actually what I feel like I'm good at and I really like about myself. One of my biggest tips would be to not listen to everybody too much, which is so hard to do. I wished I'd listened more to my intuition versus what someone else was telling me. And I think a lot of it came from me feeling like I was still learning and they were in a position of knowledge and experience, and especially if we had like visiting people come in, and I was like, of course they know what they're talking about. They're successful, they have jobs. But I think I forgot that they're coming from a different place, and like that isn't my place, and I need to feel okay about my own space. So it's almost like I want students to listen to mentors to some extent, but then I also kind of want them to not. So I pulled Bruno Munari because I always loved his work, but I didn't kind of do a deep dive into it until I was getting more into the history of illustration. He's Italian. He was working primarily in like the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and he's a graphic designer. Now, there's a lot of graphic designers who did a lot of picture books during like the mid-century, which I love. And I think the reason why I love the combination of like illustrated picture books with graphic design is because I find that sometimes graphic designers don't get kind of bogged down by what we're talking about. It's like the technicality of it or the aesthetics. They're really thinking about design very specifically, and also about like the experience that like a reader has, which is why I think that they're really great. And so Bruno Munari specifically, he's part of what they call like the second futurists in Italy. So they kind of were like a group that really embraced modernism. They liked the idea of like pushing objects as forms themselves without any specific purpose. So it's kind of like beauty for beauty's sake kind of thing. And he made a lot of work in that realm. He did a lot of sculptural work. He did object design that was beautiful and functional, but also kind of had like these kind of secondary like qualities that made them kind of quirky in a lot of ways. Some of his picture books specifically, he's made others that are much more like narrative focused, but he did do some that I love that are called the unreadable books. So they were books that had just like color and potentially like different shapes on the page, but nothing else. So he removed the title, he removed the barcodes, he removed any kind of like distinguishing feature on them, because he was playing into that idea of like it's a form, there's some sort of like narrative that you put on the form itself, but he has these other books that are a little bit more accessible. So he started making these books, I guess you would call them maybe like lift the flap books. And so I collected a couple of them, but they're pretty straightforward because they open up into like your opening spread. Oftentimes they don't have multiple pages, but they have some sort of device that helps to tell the story. So in this case, it's these boxes that are opening up, and you open up into some sort of like trunk here and a suitcase, and you keep going until you get to the very end, which is extremely small, if I can get them. Well, this one opens up like so. And I just love the playfulness of it. There's not like a very strong necessarily story in the sense that it has like an epic kind of hero's journey and they're going through lots of things. It's just very simplistic, very engaging. I think the aesthetics are really working here as well. The color's great, and I just loved this like more playful approach. And I tend to forget about that a little bit when I'm working, of like being a little bit more playful. So I really love some of his work. So this one's called Talk Talk. I think when we write books that are for kids, people tend to associate that with certain things like restrictions, limited understanding, potentially like child emotions, or maybe like an expression of a certain emotion in a child form. And I think if we do that, we really limit the capacity for what books can do, not only for those children who are our primary audience. adults can benefit, and I benefit from reading picture books. I mean, I wouldn't collect all these if I didn't love them myself. This one that I have is an object he made, which are all of these like face papers that he like designed, but he kind of designed them to have different experiences with the way that you layer them. So you would have like these two distinct faces, but depending on potentially like how you layer them up, these ones like, so let's pick one that has like a more apparent one. So you can see like this underneath it looks differently than if you put potentially the red underneath it. So very playful again, like these as just beautiful design objects I love. And I really appreciate his sense of, again, design and playfulness. This is my opinion, so I don't know if this is 100% accurate, but this is kind of what I have observed, is I think the European market is much more experimental, and I think that comes from a couple of different reasons. It could be because they have smaller markets, so they don't have to worry about producing tens and thousands of issues and having to sell those. So it's like a smaller kind of niche, and I think because their history with the written form is maybe slightly different. If we compare it to like the American market, it was kind of like more educational, like especially the beginning of like making books. And I think that applies to the history of the world in terms of bookmaking. But I think especially American marketing, it was like, we want to make sure that we can sell this. We want to do this for a specific purpose, which is usually educational. And we want to make sure that this can give us a guarantee up front. And I think also because America is very commercialized in a lot of ways, not just now, but like in the past, a lot of the books sometimes feel commercialized, or like we produce the same character over and over, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like I mentioned, I love a lot of character focused books. Like I love the Olivia books. I've always loved Clifford, that kind of like realm. But sometimes I think that leaves little room for like maybe a more experimental experience. So this is from Beatrice Alamagna, who's Italian, who lives in Paris. And she does these beautiful books, and this one in particular talks about Snow White for Enchanted Lions, in print, unruly. There's something about her freedom of form that I really like. So even though my work is a little bit more geometric, I would love to incorporate, and not copy, but like incorporate something of the freedom that she does in her illustrations in my own work. But this book in particular is visually beautiful. Exactly what I love about books, the whole blurring of lines in the audience and telling a story. And especially this, because it's telling a story of Snow White, which, has been Disney-fied, obviously has been around for a long time, but I feel like, and you would maybe think, oh, you can't really have a new approach to Snow White, but this feels like so new and unique. I just love it so much. So it definitely was like, I immediately saw it and was like, I need to put it in my collection. I really like to collect books that have some sort of connection to like the history of children's books, but also just like weird, unique ones, whether it's like just first editions or something like this. And this came up in research probably, it's been maybe like 7 years ago or so, and I heard about this book. It's called Little Fur Family by Margaret Wise Brown. She did this book with pictures by Garth Williams. It was published in 1946, but they did these special editions where they covered the book in rabbit fur. So they produced 50,000 copies. And they have this little kind of, again, case that goes along with it, and then you have the book inside, and then you can open it up and read the book about this little bear and his little family. And when it was produced, the editor, her name is Ursula Nordstrom, she's like a very pivotal person in children's book history. She said she knew that it'd be a success when one of her, I think it was her friend's children's, took it to the dinner table to feed it dinner because of the fur. So when I heard this story, I was like, I just have to have that object because I loved it so much. And they've done reproductions of it not in the 40s, I think it was maybe the 50s, with just like synthetic fur, but it didn't look the same, and I was like, I just have to have the one that has the rabbit fur on it.
Oh,
and when I get really obsessed with stuff like that, when it comes to collecting, I like have to have it. So that's I've been looking for like 6 years. I'll go on eBay occasionally, be like, is it there? I'll be like, it's not there.
What are you looking for right now?
What am I? Oh, I was looking for a couple of books by, I think you say his name, Etienne Delessert. He does these like really wacky, like, I don't know, like designs. But he has this book, I can't remember what it's called. Oh, I can't remember what it's called, but there's another one of his that I want that is just not coming up very frequently, so I keep looking for it. So
what do you like about it?
I think it's because I don't do anything that looks like that, and I think that's why some of the books that I love the most are because I don't do that. But it like gives me ideas for like how to do something new, and I'm not going to incorporate everything about it, but there is just a thing about it that I just love the aesthetic, and I think maybe I connect to it more because I'm like, I don't do anything like that, so I don't have to worry that I'm like copying it or I can't get to this level. I just appreciate it for that sake. So I'm just like, it's super cool to me. And I just love it when books for kids are not like kid-like and they're like really freaky maybe, or like have weird colors. I just love that about it. So.
Really pretty.
Yeah.